what I'm going to do for the benefit of all of those on the call is spend a few minutes contextualizing the conversation. What is this thing called strategy? Just a few minutes, and then I'm going to be talking through the typical issues that arise in strategy and highlighting how and raising questions about how some of these things may or may not have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and then raising questions that strategists would probably be concerned about before we have the chat with Cecilia. Thank you so much, Cecilia. It's an honor to be having this conversation with you. So okay, I had this there, but I won't bother with that. So I like to demystify strategy. You know, I like to make it uncomplex. So first of all, I see that a lot of people are scared by the word strategy, and a lot of people, the word gets thrown around. And I always say there's no big deal about strategy. We all do it. Every individual starts from a point in their youth, maybe in primary school, maybe in secondary school, somehow form a sense of what they would like to be in life, navigate all the obstacles, and there are all of them, so many obstacles. They have to execute those things they dream of doing, and execution, even at the level of the individual, is a challenge because there are trade-offs, there are choices to be made, and in the end, they end up somewhere. If it works, they succeed. If they fail, well, maybe they made the wrong choice of career, maybe they couldn't execute, maybe they had some weaknesses that ended up derailing their potential. And that's what strategy is. And nations, of course, do strategy. Of course, we all know in Nigeria about something we call the NEEDS, which was National Economic Empowerment and Development Strategy. Or indeed, if you read the book From Third World to First in Singapore, I regard this as the strategy text in the context of nations. There was a leader who articulated a vision in the midst of severe obstacles, who executed the strategy and turned his country into a first world nation within a period of 30 years. That was for me, it's one of the best strategy texts I've ever had to read in the context of nations. And you can contrast why one nation, Singapore, could make that transition versus why other nations may not have. And you would find lessons that strategists will find very valuable. Of course, the original sphere of strategy was the military. And it's not coincidence that it was in the military that people first had to be clear about the game they were going to play. Because the consequences in the context of the military for not having a strategy was death, destruction, your nation taken into servitude, the soldiers taken into slavery, destruction or plunder of their countries. So the consequences for the absence of strategy in the context of the military was severe. And so quite naturally, military soldiers from the earliest of times began to think clearly about how they were going to play the game. I joke, half joke, because there's also some truth indeed, that the Bible, for instance, which some of us know a bit, and maybe even all other spiritual books, are books of strategy. There's always a war going on, a great spiritual endeavor, a perpetual warfare between the kingdom and another kingdom, and some rules as to who will prevail, but a lot of contention along the way, environmental issues along the way. And I found as a teacher of strategy for many years that the context that makes my students best understand strategy is sports, because that's something they do all the time. So especially I make fun of Arsenal fans, that their team wins the games, but ultimately it doesn't often win the championship. They beat my team for the FA this time, so the egg is on my face. But sports teaches you a lot about strategy, about winning each game, about the formation of the team, about the role of leadership, the coach, the captain, the striker, the goalkeeper, about how teams work, maybe better than individuals. and all of that. And you find, even if you look into how people play the games of love and friendship, that you have to deploy some strategy. You have to identify the target market. You have to define your approach. You have to understand your end goal. And if you succeed, you win a heart and a mind. But today, our conversation is about strategy in the context of business, business strategy, corporate strategy. And without defining what corporate strategy is, in loose terms, you're always talking about success in business. You're trying about creating and sustaining a successful business, or competitive advantage, or a market share, or dominance in the market space, or superiority in products and services. You want to lead innovation, you want to create value, you want to be very profitable. Those are the aspirations behind the practice of strategy. And it is always useful, I find, because most people do think of strategy in a one-dimensional manner. They think of it as a plan. What's our plan? Which truly strategy is. It's largely about planning. I mentioned the military, in which, it was all about planning. But there's something that illustrates why strategy is not all about planning. And that's the question of uncertainty, which is at the core of our conversation today. So strategy, you may say, let me say loosely, maybe 60% planning, maybe 70% planning. But there's something else in strategy, and that's what I also want to highlight. I'm taking this from one of the brilliant strategy authors called Henry Mintzberg, who wrote about 5 P's for strategy, 5 ways in which you could understand strategy. And it's all an elephant, they're all correct, but the totality of it is what strategy is. So strategy is also a ploy, or a series of ploys. And that's the realm of tactics, specific responses to circumstances. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along to the subject of COVID-19. Curiously, one of my favorite ways of looking at strategy is as a pattern in a stream of actions. If you have the ability to recognize patterns, you probably will be a good strategist. If you see patterns before everybody sees them, whether it's in the context of the economy, whether it's in the context of the industry, when you see patterns emerging, you recognize them and you project them. And when a company is executing a strategy, a pattern emerges, whether they've written down that strategy or not. So a strategy may be viewed as a pattern in a stream of actions, consistency in behavior, whether they have articulated it or not, whether they have planned it or not. And in this realm, we talk about strategy sometimes, oftentimes, being urgent rather than necessarily deliberate. And then you can understand strategy, of course, as positioning, strategic positioning. Have we positioned this company? What is BMW? How is it different from Toyota or Rolls-Royce or Tata? So strategy is often about strategic positioning. And finally, there's the intangible aspect of strategy, the perspective of the firm, or indeed of its leadership, its worldview, its culture, the firm personality. If you take the totality of these 5 contexts, and that's what they are, context in which strategy is visible, you have a sense for what strategy is. And I mentioned the difference between strategy and tactics. You know, tactics is a part of strategy, but it's part of strategy. Certainly not all of strategy. It's short-term, it's specific, it's isolated, maybe reactive. Strategy is always proactive. It's always planning forward. It's always thinking forward. It's always long-term. It's always comprehensive. Strategy always involves a synthesis. You take all of the considerations together and you synthesize. And taking from the football analogy, strategy is always focused on winning the championship, or from the military, winning the war. But tactics may be about winning a specific game or a specific battle. Again, I will come back to this because I think it's important. So strategy, I don't like definitions necessarily, but strategy is about choosing the future for your company and how to reach that future. It may be a plan, it may be a pattern, it may be both, it may be all of those P's, but it coordinates, it unifies and integrates your decisions. So at the end of the day, the decisions and actions are the most important part, because that's what results in the variable performance that strategy seeks. Strategy seeks variable performance. You want performance to change for the better, hopefully. And you could look at this as an overarching plan for marshalling an organization to succeed in an uncertain environment. So there is uncertainty, and that's why strategy is difficult. It's about the future. It's not about the past. It's not about the present. You're doing a plan for the future. And because the future is uncertain, the job of the strategist becomes intricate. And perhaps one of the tests of strategy is whether there's a fit, the internal, the external, consistency, whether they fit with the value proposition, whether the elements of the strategy mutually reinforce themselves, and whether they lead to optimization of effort. So that's what we're talking about, just for context. And I spoke about choice of the future. And from now on, I'll begin to introduce the pandemic and the subject of today into the conversation. So the beginning of strategy is always a choice of your future. It can be the long-term future, the essence of the business, the purpose of the business. It can be a mission statement or a vision statement. Or it can be more practical and more immediate, a strategic intent for a period of time. So for instance, if we were going to do a strategic intent today for a new business, we would be thinking of what we want to achieve within, say, 3 years or 5 years, or maybe 1 year even. But strategic intent is vision made measurable, made quantifiable, made achievable in tangible terms. And then, of course, you have more shorter terms, objectives, goals, targets, trade-offs. What choices do you have to forego? And these are all important concepts in strategy, and I mentioned the intangible element, the values of the firm, the philosophy of the firm, the culture of the firm. If I ask the question, if you were doing all of this, answering all of these questions pre-COVID or post-COVID, forming strategic intent, defining vision or purpose, setting objectives and goals and targets, choosing trade-offs. Obviously, the COVID-19 has affected some of the decisions that will be made in the process. So for instance, the trade-off is how much control you want over the physical presence of your employees. Some companies all across the world have found that the inevitability of making a trade-off over physical presence of the employee in favor of their virtual activity. And that involves redefining the objectives and goals and targets, because if you can't control physical presence, you better be able to control the outcomes of their work. So COVID-19 involves in doing many of these things, focusing more on outcomes, because at least from the HR point of view, from the management point of view, putting the focus not on the presence of the guy, not on the physical meeting, but perhaps on the outcomes, so that you can then measure whether the guy is working or not. Let me walk through some of the most common frameworks that we encounter in strategy. One of the most familiar, probably the most familiar, everybody can do that, is my primary internet source, so I had to change to an alternative I had prepared. I'm so sorry.
No, but great that you have the redundancy that you could apply very quickly. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll just catch up on lost time. So I was talking about SWOT analysis just before the break.
Yes, you were just going to start on the SWOT analysis.
Yeah. So I asked a question, and I think the poll asked that one of those questions. When we were doing SWOT analysis, how much did we focus on technology competence as a barometer for corporate strength or weakness? Particularly, for instance, you were not primarily a technology company. Many firms, for instance, financial services companies, paid lip service or indeed some level of execution around technology, digital competencies, all of that. But how often did we really do that? And did we regard it as a critical test of our survival as organizations? COVID-19, of course, has changed that. I asked the question and I was pleasantly surprised that 39% of respondents said the strategy analysis identified the global pandemic as a threat. I suspect that may be a little bit inflated, but probably maybe 5% of firms pre-COVID. Yes, today everybody understands those type of risks. Or indeed, global supply chains. We saw a severe disruption of global supply chains in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially supply chains dependent on China and any of those places that were most severely affected by the COVID-19. But one of the more important contemporary questions is, are there ways the pandemic could be an opportunity? Are we revising our posture towards the pandemic to view it as an opportunity? Could it indeed have been a saving grace for institutions that did not invest sufficiently in digital capabilities? Could it be a saving grace for institutions whose supply chains were monolithic and that were dependent on one singular country source of raw materials in an era in which that country's operations were severely devastated? So there are lessons that the pandemic could be offering if firms are indeed examining their strategy accordingly. And then, of course, we talk about the business environment in strategy a lot. We talk about SPELG in the context of RTC. We have a model we call SPELG, which is around looking at the social, political, economic, legal, regulatory, and technology environments, and then all in the context of the global. And I think that, and the focus is always on sources of risk and uncertainty. And I think the pandemic has highlighted all the relevance of models of business environment analysis. So for instance, social issues. The pandemic has essentially, in many respects, at least at the height of it, crippled social society and essentially turned society into a virtual alternative in which you only communicated with most of your contacts through telephones or other internet sources or communication sources. And then, of course, political. The whole of the pandemic has become embedded in the politics, for instance, of the United States of America. I think many of the complications around the management of the pandemic have arisen because somehow in the context of an inevitable or imminent election, the US politics has become embedded in the management or the response to the pandemic. So for instance, if Trump embeds himself in a consideration around hydroxychloroquine, people are inclined not to accept it or to accept it depending on what part of the political divide they are. And indeed, even in Nigeria, we saw an election in Edo State in which whether there could be a rally or not was an issue, as political matters became embedded in the issues around the COVID-19. The big...
Opeyemi, may I just, can you please put your slide on, can you please put the presentation on slide mode?
Okay, please. I didn't do that when I came back on.
Yes. So, great.
So I was talking about the big issue being the economy. Some of us who focus more on economy than medicine, even at the beginning of the COVID-19, we were concerned that was the analysis in terms of global policy responses, was it sufficiently analyzing the trade-offs? And this is not a cold-hearted question, but the question is, economics is always about choices. How many people are going to get sick? How many people are going to die? What's the costs in economic terms? weighed against the cost of shutting down the global economy? These were very difficult questions, but understandably, in the context of something that was killing people, that didn't have a cure, that we didn't know how long it would last, we didn't know who would live, who would not live, we had to respond first to the health. And now we have to respond to the economy. And we're faced with global recession, Nigerian recession, devastation of economies, all of these considerations. So how now do we go from there to rebuilding economics? Those are all the questions. And when will the economy recover? How will it affect our businesses? What is Nigeria, for instance? How is our economic sustainability plan going to work? All of those questions have been highlighted in the context of, and I could go on and on and on and on. But the key point is to highlight how the analysis of the business environment has been dramatically altered by the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is the model I was talking about, the spell G. So will there be a cure? I'm talking about the key uncertainties, some of them that have arisen out of COVID-19. Will there be a cure? When? Is hydroxychloroquine a cure? Does the medical community agree? Will there be a vaccine? When? At what cost? How long will the pandemic last? Will Trump be elected in November? Because it now matters. Who will be alive? Who might die? Mortality itself is questioned. So the CEO, whose primary concern most times is about the success of the business, is greatly concerned these days about whether he will be alive. And you find that people tend to want to stay alive if that's the cost of corporate success. Can schools be reopened? Are air flights safe? Can businesses safely reopen? What will happen to oil prices? What will be average oil prices for the rest of 2020? And that's an important question from Nigeria's point of view. Do we have a recession, a depression, a brief recession, a deep and prolonged recession? I think the IMF's estimate is something I accept, around a 5% recession, minus 5% growth in 2020 for Nigeria. That's deep, that's severe. Will the economic sustainability plan, which is an attempt to mitigate some of that and reduce the rate of the recession maybe to 1% or less, will it succeed? Can it be implemented? Does it address the key questions? Is there enough political will and capacity for implementation behind many of the ideas proposed in that plan? And then there's a very important question, and I hear this question all the time. In the context of this, what is the ideal planning cycle? Should we abandon all planning and just plan as we go? Should we do a one-year plan that will merely address at least the short term so that we'll reevaluate after a year if the pandemic is gone? Or 18 months, or is it 2 years? Or should we ignore that and continue with our normal cycles, maybe 3 years for many firms? Or indeed, should we defer planning until the pandemic is over and just focus on tactical responses? Remember, I spoke about tactics and strategy. Do we have a narrow plan for surviving the pandemic? Maybe if, for instance, you were an airline or a hotel, which are some of the most severely affected firms in the context of this. Should we just focus on short-term survival? Or what if we were in the middle of our plan? All of these questions have become critical questions in the context of COVID-19. And when we come to question and answers, perhaps I may attempt answers to some of them. One of the most familiar strategy frameworks is the Porter 5 Forces analysis, which focus on entry into an industry, suppliers, buyers, competition, the threat of substitute products and services. And for those of us who are familiar with strategy, we know that apart from Porter, 2 other authors, Badenberger and Nailboff, introduced a 6th force that the Porter framework did not cover, and that was complementors. So we now have in the field of strategy essentially 6 forces, Porter plus, I call them, of entry, of suppliers, of substitutes, of buyers, of complementors, and of course in the context of industry competition. So the question is, what has happened to industries in the context of of COVID-19. Something that is clear is that technology and communication is the big winner. E-commerce, digital business, all of those things around technology. Let me draw an analogy with consolidation of the Nigerian banking industry. In 2001, I did an analysis of the banking industry, which I presented at Lagos Business School at their financial sector conference that year. And one of the things I saw was that the industry was consolidating. But guess what? Maybe if the industry was left on its own to consolidate, it would have taken a decade or more, or 2 decades. But guess what? 3 years later, Professor Soludo came and forced a process of consolidation, which may have taken 1 or 2 decades or more, into an 18-month period, and forced the industry to consolidate. I see a parallel with what COVID-19 has done with forcing digitalization, forcing virtualization, forcing firms to embrace digital competencies rather than do it at their own pace as we would have done. Of course, the other big losers, hotels, airlines, travel, as I've mentioned. And then oil and gas, from Nigeria's point of view, of course, the demand for oil and gas is always contingent on global activity. And when there's a collapse of global activity, as entailed in the COVID-19, there was a collapse of oil prices. So, but the strategic questions for businesses in Nigeria and in this sector is, what's the outlook for this industry? This is as a result of COVID-19. We've had previous ones as a collapses in oil prices as a result of global financial crisis, or as a result of an oil glut, or as a result of even sometimes geopolitical factors, wars, or so on. So what next? Is the oil and gas sector doomed to regular cycles of price collapses? When is the next one? If you look at my slide, we had a collapse in 2008 to 9, we had one in 2014 to 15, and now we have this in 2020. And the policy implications for a country dependent on oil and gas for its budgets and its effects, which then plague the corporate sector as the consequences of FX shortages and revenue shortages emerge, then becomes an issue for strategy in the context of firms. Agriculture is also a likely winner. Healthcare is a likely winner. The question for real estate is, of course, it's being plagued by declines even from recession of 2014-15, and doesn't seem to have recovered. It was just the beginning, a slow process of recovery, and then COVID-19 may have just reversed that. So is the real estate sector likely doomed for another postponement of its recovery? Probably yes. And then, of course, we've seen that professional services, whatever services, you have to be able to do them on a virtual basis in the context of COVID-19. The question is, are markets going to revert to the face-to-face delivery mechanisms after COVID? Probably not to the extent that they were. So this may be temporary, and some who are short-sighted about strategy may take a view that, no, this is just around the COVID, and we can go back to normal afterwards. But maybe more proactive firms may regard this as a permanent change in the equilibrium, and therefore may begin to deal with a new normal on that basis. One of the things that is clear, one of the biggest consequences of COVID-19 on Nigeria, deriving from oil and deriving also from our policy environment, which is focused on government spending and borrowings, is that we have not attracted foreign direct investment, and therefore FX inflows outside of oil have slowed. So implicitly, in the short term, at least until we change our policy dynamic, business models dependent on FX purchases appear to be in mortal danger, except for those with marginal volumes of FX input, or on the other hand, with very large FX markets that can accommodate the continued devaluation of the naira. There's a policy implication I see out of this. Policy will have to change in favor of private capital and investment versus oil revenue and borrowings. And I think the economic sustainability plan makes the right calls in that direction. So the key issue now is, are we able to implement that? Of course, it's imperative to restructure public financial management and revenue management. In the context of all businesses, and this is everybody, consumer purchasing power is being eroded. In the context, remember, of a recession, which is we're already in probably, higher poverty, higher levels of unemployment, and weaker economic outlook. So whether you're a manufacturing entity or you're a retail, the erosion of consumer purchasing power will affect everybody. Now, so I move on to briefly talk about generic competitive strategies. We have basic concepts and strategies. You compete in 3 generic matters. It's more complicated than that, but in this conversation, let's take it as 3 generic forms of competition. You try to differentiate yourself, you try to lead on cost, or you focus on a narrow segment of the market. So the question is, how does a virtual business environment affect customer experience and the customer definition of value? So the parameters around which the customer measures firms is changing. For instance, a bank, or maybe even his telecoms company. Suddenly, it's not about the beauty of the banking hall, but the beauty of the digital environment. How might the virtual business environment in a post-COVID era redefine customers' perceptions of differentiation or firms' cost structures? So for instance, another way in which this could be a great opportunity for proactive firms is that in the context of this environment, cost structures for businesses may be radically altered for those who are able to embrace a digital business model. And therefore, you could suddenly find a lot of disruption in businesses in which a contender suddenly becomes a strong a leader in an industry because he's able to take advantage of the opportunity offered by the virtual business environment. And having lost the game in the physical banking hall, for instance, if he's able to dominate the virtual banking hall, perhaps you could find new leaders across industries, in consulting, in business, in manufacturing, and all of that. How will this new environment affect business processes and therefore service delivery? How will it affect organizational structures? How will it affect innovation processes or management information or indeed HR systems? Any firm that is able to build new advantages out of all of this may indeed find that it gains competitive advantage in the post-COVID era. And I spoke already about disruption. I put this as a question: will the post-COVID era be expected to accelerate the pace of disruption in conventional or mature industries? And I think the answer is yes. It will accelerate the disruption for those who are able to respond to the reshaping of the business environment. So this offers opportunities and offers threats for those who may be less able to adapt as quickly as possible to the environment. Firms may be able to re-examine their value chain and find sources for optimizing resources, for improving customer experience, for improving business processes, for improving farm infrastructure, around management, around finance, around planning, and all of that. And therefore, may be in a position to gain new sources of competitive advantage. We talk about blue ocean strategy. I won't dwell too much on that. But the point is that the COVID-19 era offers an opportunity for people to find new and uncharted competitive spaces, new advantages, new supply chains, new trajectories for innovation, all of which suddenly may find that firm in a blue ocean in which it is relatively uncontested and therefore able to extract greater value, makes competition irrelevant, makes the firm able to create and capture new sources of demand, and makes it able to lead both with differentiation and with cost, and therefore have almost unlimited capacity to extract value. And for the purposes of my presentation, I'll take the conversation with Cecilia and with the questions and answers. But for the purposes of my presentation, the last poser I would leave for all of us is how will firms manage execution in the post-COVID era, with the assumption that a lot more of the activities will be back. Does it mean virtual meetings at 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. and 11 p.m.? Does it mean more of outsourcing? Does it mean focus on outcomes rather than work? What are all the implications for execution? Was already difficult when you had all the people under your physical control and your physical monitoring, and you could do meetings, and you could give deadlines and do all of those things man to man or face to face or in meetings. Does it become complicated?